1984 on Objective Truth and Reality. The protagonist Winston goes into an existential crisis in how to know if anything is true. This is because he works for the Ministry of Truth, an organization which notoriously changes the facts of history to support the government's current agenda. Winston's own memory runs into conflict when he is unsure of whether their nation of Oceania has been at war with East Asia or Eurasia 5 years ago. Was the party's hold upon the past less strong, he wondered, because a piece of evidence which existed no longer had once existed? But today, supposing that it could be somehow resurrected from its ashes, the photograph might not even be evidence. Already at the time when he made his discovery, Oceania was no longer at war with Eurasia, and it must have been to the agents of East Asia that the three dead men had betrayed their country. Since then there had been other charges. 2, 3, he could not remember how many. Very likely the confessions had been rewritten and rewritten until the original facts and dates no longer had the smallest significance. The past not only changed, but changed continuously. What most afflicted him with the sense of nightmare was that he had never clearly understood why that huge imposture was undertaken. The immediate advantages of falsifying the past were obvious, but the ultimate motive was mysterious. He took up his pen again and wrote, "I understand how, I do not understand why." He wondered, as he had many times wondered before, whether he himself was a lunatic. Perhaps a lunatic was simply a minority of one. At one time it had been a sign of madness to believe that the earth goes round the sun. Today, to believe that the past is unalterable. He might be alone in holding that belief, and if alone, then a lunatic. But the thought of being a lunatic did not greatly trouble him. The horror was that he might also be wrong. He picked up the children's history book and looked at the portrait of Big Brother which formed the frontispiece. The hypnotic eyes gazed into his own. It was as though some huge force were pressing down upon you, something that penetrated into your skull, battering against your brain, frightening you out of your beliefs, persuading you almost to deny the evidence of your senses. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they should make that claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it. Not merely the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. The heresy of heresies was common sense, and what was terrifying was not that they would kill you for thinking otherwise, but that they might be right. For after all, how do we know that 2 and 2 make 4? Or that the force of gravity works, or that the past is unchangeable, if both the past and external world exist only in the mind, and if the mind itself is controllable, what then? The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. His heart sank as he thought of the enormous power arrayed against him, the ease with which any party intellectual would overthrow him in debate, the subtle arguments which he would not be able to understand, much less answer. And yet he was in the right. They were wrong, and he was right. The obvious, the silly, and the true had got to be defended. Truisms are true, hold on to that. That solid world exists. Its laws do not change. Stones are hard, water is wet, objects unsupported fall towards the earth's center. With the feeling that he was speaking to O'Brien, and also that he was setting forth an important axiom, he wrote, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 plus 2 makes 4. If that is granted, all else follows." I think that the revisionism of history and the facts is dangerous and can lead to a dogmatic following of whoever is in charge, or whosoever happens to shape the laws and dictates of their society to suit their narrative. There is objective and empirical truth beyond the alleged facts that have been told, and logic and reason is used to engage with matters of knowing reality. A denial of any objectivity leads to a rabbit hole of solipsism, or could even lead to harm and rejection of the ego, which is technically what totalitarian governments want to do, to create a society of obedient, uncritical, unconscious servants who do as they are told. It is also quite interesting how language in the form of newspeak is being modified to suit the party and prevent thought crimes. This is a dumbing down of words, and as words categorizes and language defines our ability to apprehend the world, obliterating words leads to a destruction of these concepts, and this means that humanity loses another thought and perception of our physical real world. No truer can this be seen than in the internet parlance, where some words are shortened to mere abbreviations like TBH, to be honest, TLDR, too long don't read, FYI, for your information, etc. These aren't bad per se, but there is an obvious shortening trend happening. Knowing truth and reality is becoming much harder as the internet has created echo chambers, which limit thought, and neologisms and words are shaped to serve these narratives, closing access to the physical world and further polarizing and dehumanizing the other. The solution then is to continue to think critically, understand things properly in their totality through extensive studying and reading, and to be well versed in all manner of things, to keep the memory of bygone eras alive, so as to preserve history, facts, and sane reality perception. The ego and individualism must be preserved in the face of conformity, and the ultimate goal is to pursue truth, for the truth and the good are one and the same, logical and emotional, simple and multifaceted, convicting and calming, useful and beautiful, transcendent and immanent. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
She's forgotten what it's like to live on the outside, to not be in prison.
Coming to bed, honey?
Yes, dear.
It all starts with a quick look-see into someone's bag, and then it's a brisk peek-a-rooney at our phone records, and before you can say 1984, the thought police are forcing you to bend and spread.
The primary aim of modern warfare in accordance with the principles of doublethink. This aim is simultaneously recognized and not recognized by the directing brains of the inner party, is to use up the products of the machine without raising the general standard of living. Ever since the end of the 19th century, the problem of what to do with the surplus of consumption goods has been latent in industrial society. At present, when few human beings even have enough to eat, this problem is obviously not urgent, and it might not have become so, even if no artificial process of destruction has been at work. The world today is a bare, hungry, dilapidated place, compared with the world that existed between 1914 and still more so if compared with the imaginary future to which the people of that period look forward. In the early 20th century, the vision of a future society unbelievably rich, leisured, orderly, and efficient, a glittering antiseptic world of glass and steel and snow-white concrete, was part of the consciousness of nearly every literate person. Science and technology were developing at a prodigious speed, and it seemed natural to assume that they would go on developing. This failed to happen, partly because of the impoverishment caused by a long series of wars and revolutions, partly because scientific and technical progress depended on the empirical habit of thought, which could not survive in a strictly regimented society. As a whole, the world is more primitive today than it was 50 years ago. Certain backward areas have advanced, and various devices, always in some way connected with warfare and police espionage,
have been developed, but experiment and invention have largely stopped, and the ravages of the atomic war of the 1950s have never been fully repaired. Nevertheless, the dangers inherent in the machine are still there. From the moment when the machine first made its appearance, it was clear to all thinking people that the need for human drudgery, and therefore to a great extent, for human inequality, had disappeared. If the machine were used deliberately for that end, hunger, overwork, dirt, illiteracy, and disease could be eliminated within a few generations, and in fact without being used for such purposes, but by a sort of automatic process, by producing wealth which it was sometimes impossible not to distribute. The machine did raise the living standards of the average human being very greatly over a period of about 50 years at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. But it was also clear that an all-round increase in wealth threatened the destruction, indeed in some sense was the destruction of a hierarchical society, in a world in which everyone worked short hours, had enough to eat, lived in a house with a bathroom and a refrigerator, and possessed a motor car of even an aeroplane. The most obvious and perhaps the most important form of inequality would already have disappeared if it was possible, no doubt, to imagine a society in which wealth in the sense of personal possessions and luxuries should be evenly distributed, while power remained in the hands of a small privileged caste. But in practice, such a society could not long remain stable, for if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate and would learn to think for themselves, and when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that the privileged minority had no function, and they would sweep it away. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible, only on a basis of poverty and ignorance. To return to the agricultural past, as some thinkers about the beginning of the 20th century dreamed of doing, was not a practicable solution. It conflicted with the tendency towards mechanization, which had become quasi-instinctive throughout the whole world, and moreover any country which remained industrially backward was helpless in a military sense, and was bound to be dominated directly or indirectly by its more advanced rivals. Nor was it a satisfactory solution to keep the masses in poverty by restricting the output of goods. This happened to a great extent during the final phase of capitalism, roughly between 1920 and 1940. The economy of many countries was allowed to stagnate. Land went out of cultivation. Capital equipment was not able to great blocks of the population was not added to. Great blocks of the population were prevented from working and kept half alive by state charity. But this too entailed military weakness, and since the privations, if it inflicted, were obviously unnecessary, it made opposition inevitable. The problem was how to keep the wheels of industry turning without increasing the real wealth of the world. Goods must be produced, but they must not be distributed, and in practice, the only way of achieving this was by continuous warfare. The essential act of war is destruction, not necessarily of human lives, but of the products of human labor. War is a way of shattering to pieces, or pouring into the stratosphere, or sinking in the depths of the sea, materials which might otherwise be used to make the masses too comfortable, and hence in the long run too intelligent. Even when weapons of war are not actually destroyed, the manufacture is still a convenient way of expending labor power without producing anything that can be consumed. A floating fortress, for example, has loaded up in it the labor that would build several hundred cargo ships. Ultimately, it is scrapped as obsolete, never having brought any material benefit to anybody. And with further enormous labors, another floating fortress is built. In the principles, the war effort is always so planned as to eat up any surplus that might exist after meeting the bare needs of the population. In practice, the needs of the population are always underestimated, with the result that there is a chronic shortage of half the necessities of life. But this is looked on as an advantage. It is deliberate policy to keep even the favored groups somewhere near the brink of hardship, because a general state of scarcity increases the importance of small privileges, and thus magnifies the distinction between one group or another. By the standards of the early 20th century, even a member of the inner party lives in a still laborious kind of life. Nevertheless, the few luxuries that he does enjoy, his large, well-appointed flat, the better texture of his clothes, the better quality of his food and drink and tobacco, his 2 or 3 servants, his private motor car or helicopter set him in a different world from the member of the outer party. And the members of the outer party have a similar advantage in comparison with the submerged masses, whom we call the proles. The social atmosphere is that of a besieged city, where the possession of a lump of horseflesh makes the difference between wealth and poverty, and at the same time the consciousness of being at war and therefore in danger makes the handing over of all power to a small caste seem the natural, unavoidable condition of survival. War, it will be seen, not only accomplishes the necessary destruction, but accomplishes it in a psychologically acceptable way. In principle, it would be quite simple to waste the surplus labor of the world by building temples and pyramids, by digging holes and filling them up again, or even by producing vast quantities of goods and then setting fire to them. But this would provide only the economic and not the emotional basis for a hierarchical society. What is concerned here is not the morale of the masses, whose attitude is unimportant so long as they are kept steadily at work, but the morale of the party itself. Even the humblest party member is expected to be competent, industrious, and even intelligent within narrow limits. But it is also necessary that he should be a credulous and ignorant fanatic, whose prevailing moods are fear, hatred, adulation, and orgiastic triumph. In other words, it is necessary that he should have the mentality appropriate to a state of war. So this is my thoughts. This excerpt speaks quite a lot about how the need to bring about economic, social, and political equality can lead to anything but Hence the old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. When the masses decide that hierarchy is bad, they rebel against it, creating revolutions and end up installing people who are equally corrupt, self-seeking, and depraved. People will always want to grab power for themselves to the exclusion of others. This is human nature, and no amount of social engineering can change people away from their need to seek totalizing power. The history of the world becomes little more than the rise and fall of great empires, great men who are conflated with great deeds, while the masses who serve under them barely get mentioned in the history books. Revisionism is rampant in the history department, and propagandists like to accentuate one group's history over the other, for the victors write history and everything about the losers become forgotten. Before we know it, our recollection of the events decay and alter until everything that we thought of as being true is rocked to the core when tragedy or travesty hits. Constantly, the past is a reconstruction, and it is viewed with the lens of today's problems, which is anachronistic. But perhaps this is more of a testament to our flawed design. War seems to color our species as violent, savage, and an arbiter of cruelty. We use war to expand territories, gain resources, spread ideologies, advance technologies of destruction, and psychologically harm the opposing side. War becomes as natural to humanity as bipedal walking or using our opposable thumbs. Mankind is damned to war, where brother fights brother in borders, houses divided, and lives are sacrificed. This has reached the point where our weapons have developed beyond our love of others and our rationality. Weapons of mass destruction in atomic proportions that can destroy our cherished Earth many times over exist. Therefore, this excerpt provides an interesting look and commentary into class warfare and warfare in general, and how history can be easily shaped to serve these agendas. These can easily shape the masses, prime them to accept certain views that run against man's conscience, and reduce them to dust to appease primal urges. So mankind is forever faced with this dilemma: remain ignorant by the collective, accept authority, and to be easily conditioned to warfare, or stick to one's conscience morality, and remain critical, aspired for the truth, read all the of the past, and love thy fellow neighbor. Only through this can we say never again to warfare of any kind. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.
Hope in the Prose, 1984. Sanity is not statistical, according to page 248. According to page 251, it was curious to think that the sky was the same for everybody, in Eurasia or East Asia, as well as here. And the people under the sky were also very much the same, everywhere all over the world. Hundreds of thousands of millions of people just like this, people ignorant of one another's existence, held apart by walls of hatred and lies, and yet almost exactly the same. People who had never learned to think, but who were storing up in their hearts and bellies and muscles the power that would one day overturn the world. If there was hope, it lay in the prose. So here are my thoughts. I would say that yes, there is strength in numbers, but that appears to be the only strength of the lower classes in its eternal struggle against the higher classes. Revolutions are violent affairs, and usually the less fortunate, huddled masses are the first victims, many of whom fight and die just to perpetuate another cycle of tyranny and oppression, with new rulers who use the same methods as the last. In truth, the people, or the proles, or the working class, or proletariat, or whatever you call the great majority who are of the lower classes, are the people who are not capable of changing a system because they tend to be not well informed or not very well educated. Information is key,
and can change the hearts and minds of people, for it persuades others and pertains to convey truth through a specific lens, namely in support of your own side against whoever you make out the enemy to be. This had led to violence and more violence, bloody persecutions, and so on, revolutions. Perhaps the true enemy is not what's out there in the other, but what lies in your heart, your own heart. The enemy within can be more dangerous than the enemy without, or the enemy outside. So if anything, work on perfecting yourself and making yourself the best you could possibly be with the limited talent, time, and resources you have, because human potential is what can change the world. Not even a totalitarian government, nor a torturous secret police, nor even a raging violent mob could change the passions, aspirations, and virtues of the human heart. So yeah, those are my thoughts. 1984, Totalitarianism's Effects on the Mind. So I'll be reading an excerpt from page 284 to 288. There is a party slogan dealing with the control of the past, he said. Repeat it if you please. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past, repeated Winston obediently. Who controls the present controls the past, said O'Brien, nodding his head with slow approval. Is it your opinion, Winston, that the past has real existence? Again, the feeling of helplessness descended upon Winston. His eyes flitted towards the dial. He not only did not know whether yes or no was the answer that would save him from pain, he did not even know which answer he believed to be the true one. O'Brien smiled faintly. You are no metaphysician, Winston, he said. Until this moment, you had never considered what is meant by existence. I will put it more precisely. Does the past exist concretely in space? Is there somewhere or other a place, a world of solid objects where the past is still happening? No. Then where does the past exist, if at all? In records, it is written down, in records. And in the mind, in memory. Very well then. We, the party, control all records, and we control all memories. Then we control the past, do we not? But how can you stop people remembering things? Cried Winston, again momentarily forgetting the dial. It is involuntary. It is outside oneself. How can you control memory? You have not controlled mine. O'Brien's manner grew stern again. He laid his hand on the dial. On the contrary, he said, you have not controlled it. That is what has brought you here. You are here because you have failed in humility, in self-discipline. You would not make the act of submission, which is the price of sanity. You preferred to be a lunatic, a minority of one. Only the disciplined mind can see reality, Winston. You believe that reality is something objective, external, existing in its own right. You also believe that the nature of reality is self-evident. When you delude yourself into thinking that you see something, you assume that everyone else sees the same thing as you. But I tell you, Winston, that reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind and nowhere else. Not in the individual mind, which can make mistakes, and in any case soon perishes, only in the mind of the party, which is collective and immortal. Whatever the party holds to be truth is truth. It is impossible to see reality except by looking through the eyes of the party. That is the fact that you have got to relearn. Winston, it needs an act of self-destruction, an effort of the will. You must humble yourself before you can become sane. He paused for a few moments as though to allow what he had been saying to sink in. Do you remember, he went on, writing in your diary, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 makes 4? Yes, said Winston. O'Brien held up his left hand, its back towards Winston, with the thumb hidden and the 4 fingers extended. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? 4. And if the party says that it is not 4 but 5, then how many? 4. The word ended in a grasp of pain. The needle of the dial had shot up to 55. The sweat had sprung out all over Winston's body.
The air tore into his lungs and issued again in deep groans, which even by clenching his teeth he could not stop. O'Brien watched him, the 4 fingers still extended. He drew back the lever. This time, the pain was only slightly eased. How many fingers, Winston? 4. The needle went up to 60. How many fingers, Winston? 4, 4. What else can I say? 4. The needle must have risen again, but he did not look at it. The heavy, stern face and the 4 fingers filling his vision. The fingers stood up before his eyes like pillars, enormous, blurry, and seeming to vibrate, but unmistakably 4. How many fingers, Winston? 4. Stop it, stop it. How can you go on? 4, 4. How many fingers, Winston? 5, 5, 5. No, Winston, that is no use. You are lying. You still think they are 4. How many fingers, please? 4, 5, 4, anything you like, only stop it, stop the pain. Abruptly, he was sitting up with O'Brien's arm round his shoulders. He had perhaps lost consciousness for a few seconds. The bonds that had held his body down were loosened. He felt very cold. He was shaking uncontrollably. His teeth were chattering. The tears were rolling down his cheeks. For a moment he clung to O'Brien like a baby, curiously comforted by the heavy arm round his shoulders. He had the feeling that O'Brien was his protector, that the pain was something that came from outside, from some other source, and that it was O'Brien who would save him from it. "You are a slow learner, Winston," said O'Brien gently. "How can I help it?" he blubbered. "How can I help seeing what is in front of my eyes? 2 and 2 are 4. Sometimes, Winston, sometimes they are 5. Sometimes they are 3. Sometimes they are all of them at once. You must try harder. It is not easy to become sane." He led Winston down on the bed, the grip of his limbs tightening again, but the pain had ebbed away and the trembling had stopped, leaving him merely weak and cold. O'Brien motioned with his head to the man in the white coat who had stood immobile throughout the proceedings. The man in the white coat bent down and looked closely into Winston's eyes, laid an ear against his chest, tapped here and there, then he nodded to O'Brien. "Again," said O'Brien. The pain flowed into Winston's body. The needle must be at 70, 75. He had shut his eyes this time. He knew that the fingers were still there, and still 4. All that mattered was somehow to stay alive until the spasm was over. He had ceased to notice whether he was crying out or not. The pain lessened again. He opened his eyes. O'Brien had drawn back the lever. "How many fingers, Winston?" 4. "I suppose there are 4. I would see 5 if I could. I am trying to see 5. Which do you wish, to persuade me that you see 5, or really to see them? Really to see them." "Again," said O'Brien. Perhaps the needle was at 80, 90. Winston only intermittently remembered why the pain was happening. Behind his screwed-up eyelids, a forest of fingers seemed to be moving in a sort of dance, weaving in and out, disappearing behind one another and reappearing again. He was trying to count them. He could not remember why. He knew only that it was impossible to count them, and that this was somehow due to the mysterious identity between 4 and 5. The pain died down. When he opened his eyes, it was to find that he was still seeing the same thing. Innumerable fingers, like moving trees, were still streaming past in either direction, crossing and recrossing. He shut his eyes again. "How many fingers am I holding up, Winston?" "I don't know. I don't know. You'll kill me if you do that again. 4, 5, 6. In all honesty, I don't know." "Better," said O'Brien. A needle slid into Winston's arm. Almost in the same instant a blissful healing warmth spread all through his body. The pain was already half forgotten. He opened his eyes and looked up gratefully at O'Brien. At sight of the heavy-lined face, so ugly and so diligent, his heart seemed to turn over. The excerpt mentions how the past can be changed to suit the current agenda. as humans, we are actually not really great at remembering things. This is made evident in cognitive psychology, which tells us that our memories are continual reconstructions of reconstructions, which eventually become strange distortions of the past. One way to get around this limitation of our fleshy memory banks enclosed in our bony skulls is the invention of writing. Reading and writing can convey information that can continue to outlive even the authors who wrote it. That's the good news about literacy. But the bad news is that it too can be manipulated. They can be heavily skewed to one side, biasing the interpretation for the victors, and thus are also prone to many errors and heuristics. 1984 shows that authorities and governments will use history to change the present and the future. You may call it revisionism or the embellishment of history to suit an ethnic, socio-political, economic agenda, but the past can change as long as the minds of humanity can change, forgetting the actual past and replacing it with a lie. No one would know, and memories fade into the ocean of human unconsciousness. Torture and brainwashing is used to enforce party doctrine and dictates, causing people to agree and believe the impossible possible and illogical logical. This imposes party interpretation into the objective world, and thus in doing so destroys objectivity entirely. There is no way to trust anyone, not even yourself and your senses. That leads to the destruction of the mind to conform to so-called sanity, when actually it is really insane that the masses have believed it to be healthy. Doublethink principles are at play as Winston is told to repeat that 2 + 2 = 5. Operant conditioning is used as punishment is given out to answers that do not align with party doctrine. Known as positive punishment, negative reward is given when punishment is halted. As a result, this causes the mind to rewire its neurons, favoring survival over reason and logic, turning man into an unconscious, obedient machine which continues to live, but is he actually alive after that? Winston may be living and breathing after his torture, but after this so-called re-education, does he really have a soul? His curiosity, determination to undermine the status quo, and the desire to seek the true, beautiful, and good have all become quashed. This may be the future dystopia, or it may already be a reality for us all.
Brainwashed and Unpersoned. The following is an excerpt from the book 1984 by George Orwell. I'll be reading pages 290 to 292. We are not interested in those stupid crimes that you have committed. The party is not interested in the overt act. The fault is all we care about. We do not merely destroy our enemies, we change them. Do you understand what I mean by that? He was bending over Winston. His face looked enormous because of its nearness, and hideously ugly because it was seen from below. Moreover, it was filled with a sort of exultation, a lunatic intensity. Again, Winston's heart shrank. If it had been possible, he would have cowered deeper into the bed. He felt certain that O'Brien was about to twist the dial out of sheer wantonness. At this moment, however, O'Brien turned away. He took a pace or two up and down, then he continued less vehemently. The first thing for you to understand is that in this place there are no martyrdoms. You have read of the religious persecutions of the past in the Middle Ages. There was the Inquisition. It was a failure. It set out to eradicate heresy and ended by perpetuating it. For every heretic it burned at the stake, thousands of others rose up. Why was that? Because the Inquisition killed its enemies in the open, and killed them while they were still unrepentant. In fact, it killed them because they were unrepentant. Men were dying because they would not abandon their true beliefs. Naturally, all the glory belonged to the victims, and all the shame to the inquisitor who burned him. Later in the 20th century, there were the totalitarians, as they were called. They were the German Nazis and the Russian communists. The Russians persecuted heresy more cruelly than the Inquisition had done, and they imagined that they had learned from the mistakes of the past. They knew, at any rate, that one must not make martyrs. Before they exposed their victims to public trial, they deliberately set themselves to destroy their dignity. They wore them down by torture and solitude until they were despicable, cringing wretches, confessing whatever was put into their mouths, covering themselves with abuse, accusing and sheltering behind one another, whimpering for mercy. And yet, after only a few years, the same thing happened all over again. The dead men had become martyrs, and their degradation was forgotten. Once again, why was it? In the first place, because the confessions that they had made were obviously extorted and untrue. We do not make mistakes of that kind. All the confessions that are uttered here are true. We make them true. And above all, we do not allow the dead to rise up against us. You must stop imagining that posterity will never hear of you. You will be lifted clean out from the stream of history. We shall turn you into gas and pour you into the stratosphere. Nothing will remain of you. Not a name in a register, not a memory in a living brain. You will be annihilated in the past as well as in the future. You will never have existed. Then why bother to torture me, thought Winston, with a momentary bitterness. O'Brien checked his step. As though Winston had uttered the thought aloud, his large ugly face came nearer, with the eyes a little narrowed. You are thinking, he said, that since we intend to destroy you utterly, so that nothing that you say or do can make the smallest difference, in that case, why do we go to the trouble of interrogating you first? That is what you were thinking, was it not? Yes, said Winston. O'Brien smiled slightly. You are a flaw in the pattern, Winston. You are a stain that must be wiped out. Did I not tell you just now that we are different from the persecutors of the past? We are not content with negative obedience, nor even with the most abject submission. When finally you surrender to us, it must be of your own free will. We do not destroy the heretic because he resists us. So long as he resists us, we never destroy him. We convert him. We capture his inner mind. We reshape him. We burn all evil and all illusion out of him. We bring him over to our side, not in appearance but genuinely heart and soul. We make him one of ourselves before we kill him. It is intolerable to us that an erroneous thought should exist anywhere in the world, however secret and powerless it may be. Even in the instance of death, we cannot permit any deviation. In the old days, the heretic walked to the stake, still a heretic, proclaiming his heresy, exulting in it. Even the victim of the Russian purges could carry rebellion locked up in his skull, as he walked down the passage waiting for the bullet. But we make the brain perfect before we blow it out. The commands of the old despotisms was, "Thou shalt not." The command of the totalitarians was, "Thou shalt." Our command is, "Thou art." No one whom we bring to this place ever stands out against us. Everyone is washed clean. Even those 3 miserable traitors in whose innocence you once believed, Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. In the end, we broke them down. I took part in their interrogations myself. I saw them gradually worn down, whimpering, groveling, weeping, and in the end it was not with pain or fear, only with penance. By the time we had finished with them, they were only the shells of men. There was nothing left in them except sorrow for what they have done and love of Big Brother. It was touching to see how they loved him. They begged to be shot quickly so that they could die while their minds were still clean. So I would say that this is quite interesting in that the purpose of brainwashing and unpersoning someone from history is the purpose of attaining even more power, a kind of devotion out of your subjects to the point of love for those who want to control you, basically. And thus, in a way, totalitarians, despots, ideologues, they all want to be seen as someone who has the power to change minds and hearts alike. Those are my thoughts. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Freedom versus happiness. This is a summary from the book 1984. So to give some context, Winston is tortured and lectured by O'Brien about what life means in a suppressive and collectivist regime. They then ponder about what it means to be happy and how that is apparently different to what it means to be free. So this passage is from the end of page 300 to 301, that the party did not seek power for its own ends, but only for the good of the majority, that it sought power because men in the masses were frail, cowardly creatures who could not endure liberty or face the truth, and must be ruled over and systematically deceived by others who were stronger than themselves, that the choice for mankind lay between freedom and happiness, and that for the bulk of mankind happiness was better, that the party was the guardian of the weak, a dedicated sect doing evil that good may come, sacrificing its own happiness to that of others. Winston recalls and summarizes what O'Brien continually says in O'Brien's efforts to brainwash him and get him to believe what the party says, a form of re-education. Notice how governments are given two choices, a dialectical tension between either having freedom and liberty versus having happiness. Happiness and freedom are pitted against each other, as if both are not related. Perhaps in the West, especially in the Constitution of the United States of America, freedom and the pursuit of happiness are written in tandem, because they are perceived to be one and the same, where more freedom can lead to more fulfillment and the pursuit of happiness, and likewise, more happiness is capable of inspiring more freedom. In totalitarian societies, happiness can be defined as whatever the party chooses to define it. It could be controlling what the word happiness means to serve the state's interest. Even in supposedly free societies, happiness could be whatever a politician states is happiness, whether that be an emphasis on security, harmony, and stability at the expense of eroding freedoms and suppressive laws. This means the means and the ends become blurred, and the imposition of authority could emphasize notions of safety and protection against any perceived threat, but this leads to further restrictions and the tightening of control by authorities. You can also see that a degree of deception is employed so that governments can continually keep their control, stating that it's for the sake of happiness or stability or security or freedom. Also, happiness for the majority and the weak would in turn lead to no happiness at all, because in essence the state defines what happiness is, whatever that goal may be, and whether to quote-unquote, for example, liberate a nation or conduct nation building, so that whatever narrowly state-defined happiness can be achieved. But is that really happiness if you are not free to decide and choose for yourself what happiness is? Just because the state or authorities say that doing this or that leads to happiness, is that really happiness? Or is this merely an agenda of control and subservience to an authority figure for some nefarious reason? Perhaps we should
look into our own conscience and question whether we have allowed any form of control, totalitarian control, tyranny, or suppressive rules, laws, and legislations to come into and impede on our freedoms, and that these rules may be justified by the state to bring about more happiness, but in the end, perhaps they do the opposite and lead to more suppression as a result. So yeah, thanks for watching. Power to the party. How absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is a reading of the passage from 1984 from page 301 to 303. So, in summary, O'Brien lectures and tortures the protagonist Winston on the purpose of totalitarianism in the party, and that is for the party to hold onto even more power. So this passage is from the end of page 301 to 302. The party seeks power entirely for its own sake. We are not interested in the good of others. We are interested solely in power. Not wealth or luxury or long life or happiness. Only power. Pure power. What pure power means, you will understand presently. We are different from all the oligarchies of the past, in that we know what we are doing. All the others, even those who resemble ourselves, were cowards and hypocrites. The German Nazis and the Russian communists came very close to us in their methods, but they never had the courage to recognize their own motives. They pretended, perhaps, they even believed that they had seized power unwillingly and for a limited time, and that just round the corner there lay a paradise where human beings would be free and equal. We are not like that. We know that no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it. Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power. Now do you begin to understand me? O'Brien states that the purpose of power is to beget even more power. Power is that which allows groups, organizations, nation-states to do what they want and enforce it on its citizens. Notice that George Orwell references the National Socialists and Russian Bolsheviks as examples of those who utilized cruel, controlling methods, which included a secret police, torture, and state-enforced collectivistic persecution. The National Socialists blamed their woes on the non-Aryans, whilst the Russians blamed the bourgeoisie, land-owning capitalists. They both had dreams of building a utopia, of course at the expense of the hated group. And they also both believed that once they reached this utopia, they would just freely relinquish their power. O'Brien, however, stated that power in itself is the be-all and end-all, that this utopian ideal of equality and freedom is nothing but a fantasy. Revolutions merely are the means to establish the concentrations of power that we call dictatorships, and cruel and repressive methods are used for its own sake. It is, in effect, quite a sadistic position where individuals enjoy exercising power over others for its own sake. Page 303. We are the priests of power, he said. God is power, but at present power is only a word so far as you are concerned. It is true for you to gather some idea of what power means. The first thing you must realize is that power is collective. The individual only has power insofar as he ceases to be an individual. You know the party slogan, freedom is slavery? Has it ever occurred to you that it is reversible? Slavery is freedom. Alone, free, the human being is always defeated. It must be so because every human being is always doomed to die, which is the greatest of all failures. But if he can make complete, utter submission, if he can escape his identity, if he can merge himself in the party so that he is the party, then he is all-powerful and immortal. The second thing for you to realize is that power is power over human beings, over the body, but above all, over the mind. Power over matter, external reality as you would call it, is not important. Already our control over matter is absolute. O'Brien emphasizes the collectivistic identity over the individual, and thus in doing so highlights it as above and greater than the individual. The individual is mortal, weak, and can die, while the collective, the party, the ideology lives forever. Notice that the inversion of the statement slavery is freedom, freedom is slavery, tries to invoke that individual freedom would imply death and chaos, which is a complete failure. It is a complete inversion of how we see things in a free society, where death is viewed as that which drives the individual into something meaningful. Death in the totalitarian's mind is complete defeat, and their eternity is assured in the survival and maintenance of the collective. The collectivist fears death, for they can't continue to exercise power after it. This is similar to the monarchies of old, where the individual monarch can live and die, but the dynasty is meant to last forever, or as long as the family remains in power. Never mind that sons will backstab and kinslay their own fathers for power. As long as the family maintains power, the dynasty lives theoretically forever. A second and even greater contrast can also be seen in the emphasis of the mind over matter. He who controls the minds of men are more powerful than just manipulating the real world. This in essence harkens back to notions of magic, the occult or esoteric Gnosticism, but applied into the context of psychological warfare and propaganda. Those in power have secret ability or knowledge, and thus rule for the sake of ruling, exercising total power over the mind of individuals. For the sake of the longevity and stability of the party, think of individuals as drones, like ants, bees, or the Borg in Star Trek, and every individual as vessels of the party. It is literal brainwashing, a mimetic device that allows the party to hold onto power in the minds of every individual forever. So yeah, that concludes my perspective and interpretation of George Orwell's 1984 reading from page 301 to 303. Thank you. If you want to watch more videos, click on my YouTube channel and be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Bye-bye. Doublethink and Crime Stop. This is a reading and summary and also a review of George Orwell's 1984 from pages 318 to 320. So, to begin with, this is when Winston was imprisoned by O'Brien, having been tortured and brainwashed by the Ministry of Love. So, this is a reading from page 318. He wrote first in large, clumsy capitals, "Freedom is slavery." Then, almost without a pause, he wrote beneath it, "2 and 2 make 5. But then there came a sort of check. His mind, as though shying away from something, seemed unable to concentrate. He knew that he knew what came next, but for the moment he could not recall it. When he did recall it, it was only by consciously reasoning out what it must be. It did not come of its own accord. He wrote, "God is power." When governments and authority figures tell you to believe in contradictory and illogical statements, it is a barometer, I believe, wherein lies the freedom of nations. If you cannot question the authorities, They can mandate and enforce the most illogical policies, which are designed to retain their own control, to preserve power, and be as if gods. Thus, it is necessary for a robust and healthy society to question and ask whether things make sense, whether they are logical, ultimately whether they are correct and right. So to continue in the reading in page 318. He accepted everything. The past was alterable. The past never had been altered. Oceania was at war with East Asia. Oceania had always been at war with East Asia. Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford were guilty of the crimes they were charged with. He had never seen the photograph that disproved their guilt. It had never existed. He had invented it. He remembered remembering contrary things, but those were false memories, products of self-deception. How easy it all was. Only surrender and everything else followed. It was like swimming against a current that swept you backwards, however hard you struggled, and then suddenly deciding to turn round and go with the current instead of opposing it. Nothing had changed except your own attitude. The predestined thing happened in any case. He hardly knew why he had ever rebelled. Everything was easy except... So recall prior in this same book, Winston stated that he who can change the past can change the present, and he who can change the present can change the past. So it is true that propaganda can be used to deliberately omit things that have happened and make it seem like things happened that have never happened. For instance, post-war Japan managed to gloss over their atrocities that they had committed during the Second World War. Statements like Oceania had always been at war with East Asia are easy to disprove just by the facts of history, for in the 1984 timeline, they had just been at war with Eurasia, but no one would know when all the facts and documents have been edited. In a similar vein, most believe that the Middle East has always been chaotic. This is just not necessarily the case, since there was one point in history when the Middle East was the center of civilizations and the flourishing of empires, because it is where the Fertile Crescent and the birth of agriculture took place. History as well as logic are important in not repeating the mistakes of the past, but also testing the leaders of today. For in the case of Winston and his surrender to the party, this would mean the death of history, science, facts, and logic, and thus lead to the deep, dark hole of totalizing control, of which there is no way out. So this is now a reading from page 319. Anything could be true. The so-called laws of nature were nonsense. The law of gravity was nonsense. If I wished, O'Brien had said, I could float off the floor like a soap bubble. Winston worked it out. If he thinks he floats off the floor, and if I simultaneously think I see him do it, then the thing happens, suddenly like a lump of submerged wreckage, breaking the surface of water. The thought bursts into his mind. It doesn't really happen, we imagine it. It is a hallucination. He pushed the thought under instantly. The fallacy was obvious. He presupposed that somewhere or other, outside oneself, there was a real world where real things happened. But how could there be such a world? What knowledge have we of anything there be such a world? All happenings are in the mind. Whatever happens in all minds truly happens. As I mentioned in a prior video, when you doubt everything and the realness of reality, this leads to an acceptance that anything could be true. It leads to the direct death of objectivity, and an objective world is no longer possible. All understanding breaks down, and only the mighty are in charge to enforce whatever will they want on others. Denying reality can lead either to solipsism, of just believing yourself to exist, or nihilism, believing that there is ultimately no meaning. Either way, both are illogical systems, because humans are designed to be meaningful and to be together with other conscious living agents. Removing logic would mean believing in fanciful notions like relativism, postmodernism, and the rejection of objectivity, which is directly self-defeating. For example, statements like truth is relative is itself an absolute statement claiming to know what truth absolutely is, thus disproving itself. Totalitarians will always try to get individuals to believe the illogical, for if they can make you believe wrong things, they can make you believe in anything, in things that did not happen, in things that will never happen. These are but extensions of their instruments of control. He had no difficulty in disposing of the fallacy, and he was in no danger of succumbing to it. He realized nevertheless that it ought never to have occurred to him. The mind should develop a blind spot whenever a dangerous thought presents itself. The process should be automatic, instinctive. Crime stop, they called it in Newspeak. He set to work to exercise himself in crime stop. He presented himself with propositions. The party says the earth is flat. The party says that ice is heavier than water, and trained himself in not seeing or not understanding the arguments that contradicted them. It was not easy. It needed great powers of reasoning and improvisation. The arithmetical problems raised, for instance, by such a statement as 2 and 2 make 5 were beyond his intellectual grasp. It needed also a sort of athleticism of mind, an ability at one moment to make the most delicate use of logic, and at the next to be unconscious of the crudest logical errors. Stupidity was as necessary as intelligence, and as difficult to attain. Crime Stop, or a process of self-monitoring and self-surveillance, is at the end of the day the best form of surveillance for authoritarian societies. It is similar to when most East German citizens became informants for the Stasi, except Crime Stop is even better than this because it is the individuals themselves who try to stop the problem from happening, to try and stop the thoughts from coming out, and not just the neighbors and family members spying on each other. It is a form of self-censorship, something that even happens in supposedly free societies, whether it be through social media and their ubiquitous hate speech laws, or in the contracts, relationships, and kinship bonds that we have with one another and prevent us from actually speaking our own mind. Censorship, whether enforced by ourselves or others, will always be an athleticism of mind, because it creates two opposing trains of thought, two dialectical ways of perceiving the world, and only one can triumph or be modified so that both can synergistically work together without conflict. But these, in a way, can take more energy, time, and effort to create certain mental maps of the world, to reconstruct faulty schemata. It is much easier for the common man to be stupid and illogical than to risk changing the worldview, which could shake the very stability the state needs to enforce their authority and rule on others. All the while, with one part of his mind, he wondered how soon they would shoot him. Everything depends on yourself, O'Brien had said, but he knew that there was no conscious act by which he could bring it nearer. So whence lies the problem? Do you want to be free or do you want to live? The authoritarian states will try as much as possible, even to the point of ending your life and those around you, to maintain their power. For example, North Korea can send whole generations, 3 generations of people to concentration camps for a crime that their ancestors had allegedly committed. If you want to be free or live, you need to remember that the choice remains in your hands, and that everything depends on yourself. Even your sanity, your freedom, and your life will depend on the decisions that you make or fail to make. Decisions that have flow-on effects, that help to maintain the status quo and authority, or to break it. It all starts and ends with you. So that concludes my summary and reading of 1984 from pages 318 to 320 about doublethink and Crime Stop. Thank you for watching. and be sure to check out my other videos and YouTube channel. Thank you. Bye bye. The Psychology Behind Room 101, George Orwell's 1984. I will be reading excerpts from pages 325 to 329, or from Part 3, Chapter 5. The Phobias of Control, pages 325 to 326. You asked me once, said O'Brien, what was in room 101. I told you that you knew the answer already. Everyone knows it. The thing that is in room 101 is the worst thing in the world. The door opened again. A guard came in carrying something made of wire, a box of basket of some kind. He set it down on the further table. Because of the position in which O'Brien was standing, Winston could not see what the thing was. The worst thing in the world, said O'Brien, varies from individual to individual. It may be burial alive, or death by fire, or by drowning, or by impalement, or 50 other deaths. There are cases where it is some quite trivial thing, not even fatal. He had moved a little to one side so that Winston had a better view of the thing on the table. It was an oblong wire cage with a handle on top for carrying it by. Fixed to the front of it was something that looked like a fencing mask, with the concave side outwards. Although it was 3 or 4 meters away from him, he could see that the cage was divided lengthwise into 2 compartments, and that there was some kind of creature in each. They were rats. In your case, said O'Brien, the worst thing in the world happens to be rats. A sort of premonitory tremor. A fear of he was not certain what had passed through Winston as soon as he caught his first glimpse of the cage. But at this moment the meaning of the mask-like attachment in front of it suddenly sank into him. His bowels seemed to turn to water. So as you can see, O'Brien is trying to mentally break down Winston's defense mechanisms through the use of phobias. Totalitarian societies have always used torture, threats of death, and actual death to degrade and chip away at the human conscience, making it nothing but a lifeless husk in order to maintain control by any means necessary. Interestingly, this reminds me of the little Albert experiment, where the baby Albert, who initially was not afraid of animals, became classically conditioned to fear rats, which then was generalized to other animals like rabbits. This was done by hitting a loud object, like a hammer, behind Albert every time the rat was displayed, and thus resulted in the creation of a phobia. This experiment was cruel, but shows how phobias can be created and used to condition and control people. Torture and phobias are used to generate fear in people, which allows for the easy compliance and control by the authority figures, a most cruel disposition. Fight or flight. This is an excerpt from page 327. By itself, he said, pain is not always enough. There are occasions when a human being will stand out against pain, even to the point of death. But for everyone, there is something unendurable, something that cannot be contemplated. Courage and cowardice are not involved. If you are falling from a height, it is not cowardly to fill your lungs with air. It is merely an instinct which cannot be disobeyed. It is the same with the rats. For you, they are unendurable. They are a form of pressure that you cannot withstand, even if you wished to. You will do what is required of you. So the fight or flight response is an ancient instinct dependent upon the sympathetic nervous system, and it is affected by the hormone and neurotransmitter adrenaline, also known as epinephrine. Since it is an instinct, it bypasses the prefrontal cortex, which deals with logical planning and metacognitive thinking. In essence, this reduces a thinking man to an individual animal, to a rabid beast, something that totalitarian authorities would like you to believe because it is easier to control and manage animals like livestock. Such are the tools of control. Learned helplessness and hopelessness. O'Brien picked up the cage and, as he did so, pressed something in it. There was a sharp click. Winston made a frantic effort to tear himself loose from the chair. It was hopeless. Every part of him, even his head, was held immovably. O'Brien moved the cage nearer. It was less than a meter from Winston's face. I have pressed the first lever, said O'Brien. You understand the construction of this cage. The mask will fit over your head, leaving no exit. When I press this other lever, the door of the cage will slide up. These starving brutes will shoot out of it like bullets. Have you ever seen a rat leap through the air? They will leap onto your face and bore straight into it. Sometimes they attack the eyes first. Sometimes they burrow through the cheeks and devour the tongue. Perhaps the thing that totalitarians want most of all is to extinguish your sense of hope. Hope is very strong and can make individuals sacrifice everything for it. This cannot be in totalitarian societies because they need to protect the state from any chance of rebellion. Thus, they employ all means necessary to maintain control and stamp out hope for the future. When you live day to day, not thinking about tomorrow, you become easily controlled just like an animal. O'Brien then keeps taunting Winston, talking up what the British rats would do to him, degrading his psychological defense mechanisms. This is to enforce the notion of learned helplessness, or when individuals learn to give up. That is the best case scenario for authoritarians, because in it there is no hope of escape. Similarly, experiments in learned helplessness have shown that animals like dogs and elephants and many others learn to become helpless, being unable to escape their situation. As a result, even with just a little bit of control, they remain forlorn and give up any chance to flee. No higher loyalties. This is an excerpt from page 329. The mask was closing on his face. The wire brushed his cheek. And then, no, it was not relief. Only hope. A tiny fragment of hope. Too late, perhaps too late. But he had suddenly understood that in the whole world there was just one person to whom he could transfer his punishment. One body that he could thrust between himself and the rats. And he was shouting frantically over and over, "Do it to Julia! Do it to Julia! Not me! Julia! I don't care what you do to her! Tear her face off! Strip her to the bones! Not me! Not me!" Now I think this is the final nail in the coffin. What authoritarians want the most. They want to break up the last remaining libidinal and familial ties that we have with each other. Without it, there are no more kinship bonds, no friends, no families, no lovers, no acquaintances, no higher loyalties. The only thing left is a relationship with the state and the state alone. That is truly hell on earth, when there is no more love, just lonely, mindless devotion to the state and a willingness to cast someone else, to rat them out, regardless of your own relationship bonds with others. For the state, as a result, achieves totalizing power over the individual forever. Hence, in summary, the state can employ phobias, fears, the fight or flight instinct, learn helplessness and hopelessness, and finally the destruction of authentic connections with others to maintain their grip on control and power over the individual. This finally concludes my in-depth videos about George Orwell's 1984. It's quite a depressing note, I know, but now you guys are all equipped with recognizing totalitarianism and the growth of the ever-controlling, ever-authoritarian state. It has been quite an eye-opening journey. Thank you for watching my videos and have a good day. Bye-bye.